Oh, looks like a Count Dracula.
Oh, nice.
Hello, UK Crime Book Club. I'll tell you what we're talking about in a minute, but we will move on, and I will introduce Sean Campbell, who I have now known kind of through Messenger and Facebook posts for a while, but this is the first time we've spoken.
Indeed.
So it's really lovely to finally meet you and to have you on with me. Congratulations on Murder by the Mob. Absolutely brilliant. Do you want to introduce it? And I'll show this cover.
So it's the first in the D.I. Rafferty series. It's a spin-off to my DCI Morton series, which wrapped up after 7 books. And this one is essentially, can you break witness protection? Why would you break witness protection? And what happens if you do?
You've been practicing that.
No, not at all.
Like it. So, why did you feel like now was the right time to break off and do something with some of the same cast, which we'll go back to, and just do something different? It must have been quite fun to do, but it must have been a bit daunting as well.
Yeah, it's very daunting. So I thought when I planned out the Morton series, I knew that there was an ending, that ultimately he wasn't going to be a policeman forever. I didn't want to go down the route of having him be essentially a consultant or not aging. I thought that would be dishonest, disingenuous. And it meant that if I tried to keep him at the same point in time for the whole series, none of the other characters could grow. And of course, they've all got their own journeys. So although Morton was my main protagonist, I wanted to see what would happen to Rafferty, what would happen to Arda, what would happen to Maybury. And Rafferty just struck me as the most interesting sort of next character, because although she's not as highly ranked as Morton, she's essentially doing the same work because it's out in the field. And she was almost his protege. And there's a distinct contrast between her slightly more methodical approach to things and his very cerebral approach to things.
That's always interesting, though, isn't it? Having two people who, if you had two people who worked together who thought in the same way, I'd imagine there's going to be so many things that they'd overlook because the brains are working in the same way. And you want two people who have that different approach.
Yeah, you don't want to fall into groupthink, because if everyone says the same stuff, you're going to narrow down on one path and just run down it, whether it's right or wrong. And if it's right, that's great. If it's wrong, it's a complete disaster. And you want people to check each other, to bring different points of view, to think about things that the other character is not thinking about. And having a young female character and an older man, you've immediately got multiple contrasts there, that they think about the world in different ways, that they grew up in different environments. She's very good with social media, much better with people. She's got a background in sex crimes, so it's incredibly different to his background working murder for most of his career.
I think the different backgrounds are really interesting because obviously because their ages are different, you've got different levels of the things that they will have seen during the job.
Yeah.
You know, the day-to-day things. So the way that crime has changed, and I know there's some fundamental things that kind of stay the same, but the way that different groups branch out in different ways and different people kind of, you know, do the things. So you have got such a wealth of options.
Yeah.
Is that ever daunting?
Yes, because it means you've got all those things you could pursue, but you have to pick a focus for each book. And obviously you want to try and make sure that if you're doing a series, you're going to put one focus to each of the books, so that you plan not just for now, but for 2025, 2026, 2027. And ideally you've got character arcs that go right across the series, people you plan to bring back. And so there are a lot of options. And I tend to use a program called Aeon Timeline that lets me plot out everything to the absolute nth degree, because where people are, when they are, what each character knows in relation to all the other characters, because there are a lot of moving parts in my stories, and I tend to have a lot of points of view that you know, everyone's got their own objectives, their own challenges, and they might have slightly different perceptions, slightly different understandings of the situation, and managing that is incredibly difficult. It turns everything into a project management tool, essentially, that you need to be in the right head at the right time for the right chapter in the right order, and otherwise it starts to break and fall apart and not feel very realistic, which I think it's one of the biggest challenges in writing a very modern crime novel.
You're making it sound super, super easy to do what you do.
No. I wish it was. I'd just put out 20 a week if I was.
So let's go right back to the beginning, because we haven't done this before and I'm really excited. So you started the crime fiction books in 2012,
yeah.
But I don't feel like that's when you started writing.
That was my first ever attempt at fiction of any kind as an adult. I mean, I wrote short stories as like a teenager because I was a bit of a loser who would sit in his bedroom and try and write stories to amuse himself.
Me too.
Exactly, the best kind of teenager. But someone told me I couldn't do it, that I wouldn't be able to write a book, because it is a huge challenge. Um, and someone bet me I couldn't. So I said, of course I can. I'm very arrogant that way. And I said, not only will I do it, but I will write it, edit it, and publish it in 90 days. And that was the challenge. And
90 days?
90 days, that's all I gave myself to write, edit, and publish the first one. And I did it in 23, which I wish I could do again because I didn't know what I was doing. It seems to have worked bizarrely, but now I sort of know the rules. I know that I did not follow the rules at all. So it's kind of liberating to just have a go in sort of isolation, away from everyone else, away from the crime fiction community, and just have a very fresh, unusual take on a murder mystery.
It's amazing that 27 days, you gave yourself 90 days and you did 27.
23.
23, sorry. Told you my memory's shocking. Maybe the lack of rules, like you say, was a catalyst there, but
I mean, I didn't edit it very much. It meant that everything was very sequential, which made it felt like it flowed really, really well. But of course, it meant that there wasn't all the sort of detailed layering in that I try and put in my modern books. And I think if you go back and read them and compare and contrast, you'll see that it's very different. I'm not saying better or worse, but I'm sure some people would say worse.
We've got some hellos already. So I know Ken Ward was looking forward to this tonight. So good evening to you both, says Ken. And Philip Jordan, hi Philip as well. Evening, talking long arcs. I'm thinking Sean's a serious planner.
Yes.
So you talked a little bit a minute ago about the software that you use.
Yeah.
But it must be so let's talk about the planning bit first, and then let's talk about kind of how much it changes then as you work through it, or whether you're quite strict with. Right. Okay.
So I try and start with essentially the concept. So what's the thing that makes this a really unique story worth telling? Why this story? Because I don't want to retell the same story everyone else has done. I don't think that's worth time. So for Dead on Demand, it was essentially a murder swap, but not just one, but several. For Murder by the Mob, as I said in my intro, it was about breaking witness protection. And witness protection I find really interesting because the idea that you can take someone who is potentially a witness to a crime or potentially a junior gangster of some kind and pick them up, give them a new life, and plonk them somewhere else. It's fascinating. And you have to wonder what happens to someone who is in that sort of program. And we don't have many details in the UK at least. But there's a book called WITSEC, which is about the US equivalent. And they had to deal with an awful lot of mobsters. They have to deal with a lot of witnesses to mob crimes. And there's this horrible tension between making sure they testify and giving them a deal in return for testifying versus the needs of the communities which are inevitably dropped in. Because if you had a new neighbor moving across the street and it turned out that they were actually a hitman for the mob, you would probably feel a bit miffed. And they're potentially very dangerous people. And some of them have gone on to commit crimes while under the protection of the US government. They've had people that have gone back to their old lives. And they famously say that nobody has been killed in the witness protection program, which is interesting because I think physically leaving your life is the easiest part. I think emotionally leaving everyone about who you are and everyone you know is much harder. So I want to explore that concept and think about, well, if a couple went into witness protection, what happens when they break up? And she wants to go back to her old life, but she obviously has to say where she's been for several years. That would potentially lead them to the guy who's under protection still, and he'd have to be moved again in theory. Or what if someone was really into a hobby and they just couldn't give it up? I mean, if you were really into watching Arsenal and your entire life was supporting Arsenal and you had season tickets and you spent all your time watching the matches, and then suddenly you were ripped away from your life and told, don't go anywhere near the world of football at all. Don't buy memorabilia, don't turn up to matches. Could you do it? Because it's asking you not just to give up your life, it's giving up your personality because you're going to have to change everything about who you are in order to go under the radar and avoid detection. You're not going to go from being an Italian mobster who's been out on the town drinking on the Costa del Crime in the south of Spain and running drugs and going on fancy holidays to sitting in the dark and sewing and watching telly all day. The lifestyle change is just not sustainable. And the idea you could take a criminal who is a hardened criminal, expect them to just sit around watching TV, doesn't strike me as very plausible. That even
No.
the risk of being hunted down, it's that balance between living and not, and you have to take risks. And I'm sure criminals are the sort of people who would take more risks than I would. That I think is really interesting because they're never going to just slot into a civvy life. It's a bit like if you're in the military and you come back, there are big changes to adapt to, and it's an even bigger change coming out of a very criminal lifestyle. And you look at people who've come out of jail and how they slot back into society, and they find it incredibly difficult. And if you had to do that while also suppressing everything about who you are, with nobody behind you, no support network, potentially less in the way of funds, because of course the government is not going to replicate millions of pounds in illegal funds. They're just going to give you enough to live, a stipend, until you find a job. But can you work a 9 to 5, shelves at Sainsbury's, hang out in Weatherspoons, do what normal people do? Or would you go back to your life of crime because it's high risk, high reward? There's an adrenaline hit, there's an addiction there, there's an easy access to money, women, violence, all the things that criminals tend to pursue.
It's that key word that you use there, risk, because, say, for example, the first month, they're fine sitting in front of the TV, chopping their own wood, building a log fire and thinking, oh, isn't this lovely? This is like retirement to a degree.
Yeah.
But then there's bound to be that element of, right, okay, well, I'm just going to go there and just see what happens, and then I'll come back and nobody will see me. Put a cap on, be fine. And then that kind of thing of building on the risk, and that's what you've played with. It's that slowly kind of knowing that I'm going to ease back into it, and nobody's going to know what I'm doing. It'll be fine.
Yeah, I think criminals tend to think if they get away with something once, that they can repeat it, and they will get away with it the second time, and the third time, and the fourth time. And there's a guy in the news this week, a fraudster who was sending bills that were completely fictitious to Facebook and Google, and he managed to steal something like 120 million quid. And it was just doing it with a very simple crime of make up very vague bills and send them to big corporations, and they paid it because they thought it was genuine bills they owed. And if he'd stuck to small amounts, if he'd nicked 10 grand here, 20 grand there, he probably wouldn't have got caught. But as soon as you start repeating it too often, or you go for big amounts and get greedy, you're going to get caught pretty quickly. And I think that's interesting because you sort of adjust your risk appetite, don't you? For anything, if you do something once and you're safe, you start feeling more confident. If you've had an accident and you get back on a motorbike and you go out riding and you're fine, you might then go a bit faster, or you might drive in the rain, or you might then drive in the rain while having a couple of drinks. And each time you increment your risk up just a little bit because you become more tolerant and less risk sensitive. And criminals do the same thing, that they keep pushing the envelope because there's never enough money. And that's I think true for a lot of people in the normal world. It's true for criminals that anything that's easy, there's the sort of emotional adrenaline side that compels them to want more. And I'm sure some will enjoy it as well. Just taking money from especially faceless corporations, some people are going to feel quite good about doing that and want to do more of it, especially if they can justify it to themselves in some way.
I've never really thought about just how much risk plays such a big part in a lot of the books that I read. Don't kind of, when you talk about books as much as we do, and you think about all the different themes, risk, I can't say is one that I've ever really thought too deeply about, but actually it's everywhere.
Yeah, it's usually not the overt topic of the story, but there's always a risk in nearly everything. It's, did you get rid of the body in one way or another? And does the killer try and eliminate all risk? Are they hyper forensically aware and they wear gloves and hairnets and they bring bleach with them and all the things that you can do to minimize the amount of effort, that evidence? Or are you got the sort of killer that strikes hard and fast and it's very brutal, it's very quick, and you're not thinking about low cards exchange principle, you're thinking about that CCTV camera? And different criminals with different approaches, different educational backgrounds are going to be very different. And I think if that's authentic in the story, it makes it all a lot more interesting because it's very causative, and the psychology behind it marries in. That if you're a risk taker and you're willing to blitz people hard and fast, you get a very explosive, quick crime story, but it's not a clever, sophisticated cat and mouse crime story that other people prefer. And you've got to tailor the right characters to the right story.
Definitely. I wanted to ask you about your research for this. So you were saying about WITSEC in America is quite different and that there's not really much to talk about. And obviously is it the UK Protected Person Service we have here in the UK now? And I think a lot of readers would, be okay with it just saying WIPRO or witness protection, I think. But increasingly, got to get the kind of details right. But what did you actually manage to find out in your research? And were you surprised by how little there was to know and by anything that you found?
There is very little out there. There's a few sort of guiding principles, and they broadly mirror the US system, that they try to balance risk, again, coming back to that, but they're thinking about communities, they're thinking about costs, they're thinking about the recidivism rates, whether people are going to reoffend, they're thinking about violence, they're thinking about the families, and of course it's the risk reward of, do you give people a place in witness protection at all? Because if you don't, you're not going to get people coming forward to testify. And of course, that is part of the overriding problem. It's that letting a little fish go to catch a big fish, and that is always the overriding principle behind witness protection when it comes to criminals, at least. Obviously, there are a lot of people that are just witnesses to crimes, overwhelmingly women, and they're put into witness protection, and they have to suffer the same problems. I think by and large they're better at sticking to it because they're not used to a criminal lifestyle, and so slotting back into a very similar life somewhere else in the country is quite interesting. So one of the challenges that they tend to have is finding an appropriate place to put you. So if you were, say, a Russian speaker and we took you and dropped you in Shetland, which would feel like a really natural place, though, far away, miles from anything, nobody's going to find you there. But you're the one Russian speaker in Shetland, you're going to stick out like a sore thumb. Yeah. Whereas if we put you in Belize Park, where there's lots of Russian millionaires swanning around, you're going to be able to sort of hide in the crowd. And so the principles that they apply are just the same as the States, that you need to be careful that it's balancing the risk. They haven't, according to the records, had anyone caught in witness protection. But if they'd had, I'm sure they wouldn't admit to it. I mean,
yeah, that's what I was thinking. I mean, you can't. To admit to it is one thing. To admit to that kind of colossal failure is one thing. But then allowing other people any insight at all, they're just going to you just close it down. You'd shut it down. You wouldn't allow any conversation about it because there are too many people. It's such kind of a spider web, isn't it, from that one person, and then joining to whoever's committed the crime that they've witnessed and all of this. I can't imagine. You're talking about, moving parts when you're thinking about books. The idea of being responsible for somebody's protection in that kind of situation must be unbelievably difficult.
It's effectively a military operation because it is. It's the government that are doing it. It's not the police themselves. It's all state sponsored. It's UK wide, which obviously, if you know the law is usually England and Wales or Scotland, you immediately spot that it is a security matter. It's a reserve matter for the UK government, and they have to control within their own organisation how many people know. So in the States, again, I'm going to go back to the States because there are documented evidence of it. So it's the only one I can really point to.
Yeah,
is that they have US marshals, and one marshal is assigned to one witness, and they handle them for their entire case until they hand them off. Either they exit the program, die, or they retire. So they have sort of a very, very small number of people. It's all very much a needs-to-know basis because you wouldn't want your entire organisation to be able to log into a database and see where all the protected witnesses are, because that would mean one breach and it's a fundamentally underwhelmed and undermined. So you have to be thinking about not only what the public know, is which of your people know, in what circumstances do people need to know, when do you need to tell, for example, the local police that you've just dropped a paedophile within 500 yards of a school, all those sort of things where you have to flag information for safeguarding, and what are the obligations and how they balance those obligations against the overriding principles of achieving justice in big gang crimes, in murder cases, etc. And I think it's a very difficult line to tread. I wouldn't want to do it. I think it will be far too stressful. And you're going to make the wrong call occasionally. You're going to think someone isn't a risk when they are, or you're going to not offer someone witness protection, and then you're going to see they get murdered. And I suspect that happens relatively regularly, but we're never going to hear about it. And as soon as you announce that there's a flaw in witness protection, you effectively undermine confidence in the system. So anyone that's considering going into the program would go, it's not worth it, I'll take my chances. Sorry.
Yeah, it's all right. Or anyone who's feeling a bit edgy, that might be the time that they try to run.
Yeah, exactly.
It kind of, all of a sudden you've got, however many, because I'm sure we don't even know how many people there are in witness protection.
No, we don't.
I would imagine that would be very closely guarded.
I mean, I would think it's probably low four figures if we're being realistic, just comparing to how many how many crimes we've had that have had witnesses testifying from behind screens under pseudonyms, those sort of things you can sort of use as a proxy to guess the numbers. But you're right, it could be enormous numbers. There could be witnesses for terrorism cases that we're never going to hear about. And like you said, if people are tempted to run, running is hard. I mean, that's one of the other themes of Murder by the Mob is that
Yeah.
we've got people who are on the run. And I think that's quite an interesting one, because how do you run? Because it's almost doing the same thing as being put into witness protection, but you're doing it on your own steam with your own resources. And Tiny Bukowski, the big crime boss who ran away in the Morton series, is still on the run on the lam in Murder by the Mob. And there are several people trying to find him. And you've got a killer who knows him and knows who his lieutenants are and knows they're going into witness protection and wants to find them. But if you were trying to get revenge on your old mobster boss or gangland boss, depending on the American term or not, because I know a couple of people don't like the term murdered by the mob, but if you read the book as you have, you'll know why it's mob, not murdered.
And it wouldn't be something, I mean, we're not going to talk about that, but it wouldn't be something that would bother me anyway. But yeah, I think I would never make a judgment on a title till I've finished the book anyway.
Yeah, it's the
because
last
you never know where it's going to appear. Yeah. Speaking of, yeah, I don't think, right, we won't talk about anything to do with the actual characters, but there's some familiar names in this book, Sean.
Yeah.
Does everybody know? Am I going to spoil it for anybody?
Anyone who's been in the books knows. Often I will allow people to be in the book in return for a charity donation. I've done that before. I know that's been a thing on UK CBC. And yeah, I'm quite happy to put people in. I've done it as competition wins. If people would like to be in a book, I'm very up for it, but I will probably treat them terribly. Just fair warning. If you volunteer to be in a book that's all about gangs and murder, you're going to be a bad guy. Or a victim. I mean, it's one or t'other, really, isn't it?
Has anybody said to you, okay, I want my name and you can either go nuts with what you do with me, or my name but, and giving you like a caveat of any kind, or is the deal you get to decide what happens because it's your book?
It's got to be carte blanche. If you want not to be in it after you've read it, I always send out a copy to people that are named in it before it goes to print. But because I can change it up until relatively late in the day, but I'd rather not. I'd rather people are quite happy to give me carte blanche to do what I like, to put them in, to make up ridiculous, over-the-top stories, and just see what happens. And it gives people a good giggle when you come across a name. They're like, oh, I know them.
I like that idea of sending people a copy beforehand just to check. But really, if they've given you carte blanche, they get what they get.
Exactly.
A lot of fun for you. Yeah. I want to go back to Philip Jordan's question about planning and plotting, because we went right back, because as soon as I picked this up, I was like, oh, Wipro, okay, here we go. I love that kind of thing. So we've gone kind of right away from Phil's questions. So talk to us about the whole thing.
So I like to try and plot every sort of subplot individually. So if I've got one character who's hunting down a bad guy, as in this one, if I've got someone who's on the run, if I've got several criminal characters, if I've got ongoing actions that are happening throughout the book, and I want them to each make sense on their own, and then I want them to fall like dominoes. I want every single scene to be impactful, and I want, ideally, everything to be grounded in the right emotions and the right logic, that if you put yourself into the shoes of any one of those characters, you might consider making the same decision they did. And I want you to see that the decisions they make are what drives what happens next, and that everything is very much causative. And I like to imagine the whole thing is a game of dominoes where it's the inciting incident at the start. Guy decides he wants to get his own back on his old mob boss through to the end, where, you know, I won't say what happens because
good.
And everything in between, you've got to see that the only way it could have happened is that way. Once you reread it and see why it all happens that way. And so I check for things like timelines and making sure that all of the details, including a lot of historical details, are accurate, that the characters are aging between books, that they ideally don't change watches or cars, that all those tiny details are there, that I've got a list of all the sort of serious decisions they made in earlier books, so that I can make sure the decisions they make are effectively in keeping with those previous decisions, because you don't want people's personalities changing overnight. if your people are going to change and go and herring off in a different direction, there's got to be an inciting incident. There's got to be something that causes that to happen, and it's always going to be about the conflict between either the character whose head we're in and the plot, or the character whose head we're in and circumstance, or that character and one of the other characters. And I think it's that that makes it really interesting, because you want to see how they deal with that conflict, what happens as a result of that conflict, whether there are unforeseen, unintended consequences, whether they get what they want, what the cost of getting what they want is, and all of that has to sort of fit into the overarching plot and how it fits together. So if they want to commit a murder, how have they got the body out of wherever they killed them? How did they commit the murder? Where did they get the weapon or the poison? How did they get the access? What did they have to do to get that? Why did they think that was the best way to do it? Is it based on their personality? Do we look at the statistics? For example, women often murder by poison compared to men. We all know that murders are often a man killing his spouse. That's one of the most common murder investigations you're going to come across in real life. So you need to ask why you're going beyond that. What makes this case unusual? Makes it the 5% that's not straightforward. And if you've got a character who's taunting the police, why are they taunting the police? What are they trying to get out of it? Is it just an ego thing? Because that has been done to death. But if they're trying to taunt the police because they want the police to act in a certain way, because they'd like the police to reveal certain information, and they're trying to deduce from where the police allocate resources as to what might happen next, and trying to effectively twist the police's own investigation against them, that is much more interesting. It's more causative, and it makes the character more Machiavellian, really. They're much more scheming, and I think those are the most interesting criminals, are the ones that are scheming, the plotters, the guys that could get away with it if you didn't have a great police team responding. Because you don't want a boring, straightforward stabbing, shooting, because it's just not interesting. There's no emotion behind it. There's no pathos behind it. You haven't got a victim who's interesting. You want all of the people to have their own story, including the victim. Why was the victim in that place at that time? What caused them to antagonize the killer or killers? And everybody has got a backstory, and that, I think, is the sort of bulk of the iceberg. And then this story, as you tell it, is just the very tip. It's just how all of that comes to a head, why it comes to a head, why it's now, why it's in that way, in that place, in that time, and all of that has to be reflected back in the plan. And ideally, you try and sort of come up with that in a very sequential manner, but inevitably it doesn't work that simply, and you end up sort of moving things. You want to reduce characters down to try and simplify things, because you can't run with a team of like 38 police detectives running a murder investigation team. You've got to focus on one or two lead characters and then reference that the rest of them are there in the background. So you might make some non-procedural choices, like having one IT guy or one forensics expert who is sort of your go-to for everything, when in real life you'd have dozens of people, and it might go off to private laboratories. And you have to make those compromises, and you have to know when you're deviating from the rules, because people will call you out on it if you get it wrong. And getting it right makes it more authentic and more interesting. But you can't be too authentic, because then you just have a policeman investigating a very dull murder and then filling in 300 pages of paperwork, which would be equally boring.
One of the things that I thought from quite early on, we realised some of the things that are happening. So the prologue, excellent, straight in there. I don't think it's a spoiler to ask you to describe the prologue. I mean, it's literally the first couple of pages.
Well, exactly. It's a very simple opening. The killers go up to the front door.
It's very effective.
Knock on the door. They say it's a furniture delivery. He looks very confused. Turns out, he's in witness protection, as you probably guessed from the story. And they go in with the big box. He's looking quite curious. One of them starts cutting open the packaging. And just as he leans in to see what's in the massive box, one of them whacks him from behind, kills him, puts him in the box. They seal the box back up and take him back out the way they came. Wrong delivery, they say to the neighbour on the way out. And you've just killed a man, it's contained all the evidence, taken the body in and out, and it's all over in 5 minutes. It's a blitz attack, but a very considered, very sophisticated blitz attack that's simple to execute. But to come up with that would be a criminal who's quite clever. You aren't going to think, I'm going to park a nice white generic van that's stolen with chrome plates on it that nobody will ever trace back to me. I'll have a massive box that looks like I've got some furniture in it. I'll carry it in with my accomplice. We'll kill a man, shove him in the box and take him back out. And then we've got a nice pre-packaged body and nothing left for the police to find. And it's quick. And
it really is. It's quick and effective.
Who did that? How did they do that? And more importantly, why? Why did they want to take that guy out of his house? What did he do to them? And it sort of asks so many questions that you want to find out what happens next. And I think that's what crime does best, is makes you really curious about who and why and how and what. And I love playing with that and coming up with scenarios where I don't quite give you everything, that you see what happens, but I'm showing you just enough to make you want to read the next bit to work out. And then, of course, we change the point of view, and you're left bereft wondering what happened in the prologue and have to come back to it, which is why it's slightly offset in time. And prologues, I think, are great fun for that, because you can offset things so they're not exactly contemporaneous to the rest of the plot. Because there's a temptation, once you start kicking a murder investigation into overdrive, that all the police officers want to act quick. That it's that first sort of golden hours of the investigation are straight away. That you've got an opportunity while people's memories are fresh, while CCTV is available, while the evidence hasn't literally washed away in the rain, and so you get sort of fast and slow parts that are interesting, and you want to sandwich those and allow enough breathing room between them that the events are plausible and could have happened. And that's where I come back to the timeline software, that if you plot it on there and you can see, oh yeah, that's happened there, and then you put your prerequisites in. So once the police have found the body, it will take 48 hours to get X bit of forensic evidence back, because it's got to go to the lab. But they don't work on Sundays, so you need to move that so it's Monday. And then that evidence coming back in might trigger a conversation that then triggers a thought in the detective's mind. And if you skip the middle bit and just have them immediately think about it, it's too quick, it's too easy, and it's not based on the actual investigation. Because after all, procedurals are supposed to be about the procedure. And the beauty of police work is that police officers are very methodical. The College of Policing do give you most of the outlines on what you're supposed to do, and then you see an individual detective bring their own flair to it, their own panache, their own creative way of thinking. And I think that's a really interesting thing to marry up. And seeing how a detective would solve an equally baffling murder, you need a detective who is able to live up to the challenge of coming up with that.
I really like as well the right at the start where you've got you don't have Russian roulette, you have something different.
Ukrainian roulette.
Yeah. So I thought that was again, do you want to explain this scene, because what happens in this just sets everything in motion?
Yeah, so it's in the first chapter after the prologue, we go way back in time to essentially an initiation ritual, a joining for the gang. And you've got a gun, you load it with one bullet, you spin it around exactly as you think for Russian roulette, but instead of putting the bullet to your own head and pulling the trigger, the gang have kidnapped your mother, and she is kneeling on the floor. Your older brother's been through the ritual, you've got the gun in your hand, and you've got two choices: you shoot her or you don't. And if you don't shoot her, you know that all of the gang will shoot her for you, and then they'll shoot you. So effectively, your choice and agency is completely taken away, and these young teenage boys are forced into doing something completely abhorrent, and that's Ukrainian roulette. It's a completely different twist on the gang initiation. And of course, once you've done something like that, you are so beholden to the gang, you're so deep into that sort of cult-like atmosphere, that whatever they ask you to do after that pales in comparison. If you have shot your mother or not, or been willing to shoot your mother, then of course you're not going to question it when they say move that body, or go and beat that guy up, or steal that car, because you've already set the bar for criminality and what you're willing to do so high that everything else is a given. You are compliant with that gang's instructions. I think it's really interesting, because of course it's effectively a metaphorical severing of family for the gang, as well as being proof of loyalty. And of course, if you fail, you're dead. So the gang is filtered either way, that they either get a very loyal recruit or they get rid of a problem, and that's incredibly cold. And I like seeing that contrast.
Yeah, I found it really interesting, because you've got this kind of idea that actually maybe it's less risky. There's one chance in 6 that I'm actually going to kill her. There's 5 chances that I might not.
Exactly. And
so it's even colder in one way, but in another way, it gives them a bit of hope as well.
Yeah, it's a roll of the dice, a literal roll of the dice. If you roll the dice, you've got a 1 in 6 chance she dies, 5 in 6 chance you both live. So if you don't roll the dice, you both die 100% of the time. So the math is very, very clear. You should do it.
Yeah.
And yet, morally, could you shoot your mother in that circumstance?
I've read something else recently where it's not the same thing, but there is a similar thing, and it's always just brutal.
Yeah.
It's in no way like your story, but there's an idea of similarity somewhere that is actually I can't say what it is because it would spoil something that isn't out yet. So,
Yeah.
but it's that cleverness of you authors that you're diabolical. Let's be glad that you get it all out on the pages and that you're not all running the world, running the criminal gangs, because I feel like you could.
What's off the streets?
I kind of feel like I need to ask, what would be your undoing under Wipro, under the UK Protected Person Service? Now, obviously I've got husband and kids. If we're looking at me as an individual, my whole life revolves around crime fiction. It impacts so many levels of my life. So I don't know how I would walk away from that. What about you?
You have to, because reading books is a very private activity. I mean, if you just had a Kindle, nobody's going to see what you're reading even. So I think you could probably
somebody hacks into Amazon and finds out. there's ways. It's one of those things where you wouldn't know if I'd won. I wouldn't tell anyone if I won the lottery, but there would be signs, gold-plated bookshelves, which I wouldn't have, but it's the first thought in my head.
It's a bit of a waste of gold, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think I've spent so long thinking about how you would hide in witness protection that maybe I could do it. I don't know. I think it depends whether you're cut off from your entire family or whether you've got your partner going into protection with you. I think is easier.
Yeah.
And of course, for those of us that sort of have been inside a lot over the last 4 years, when we had lockdown, lots of us were very cut off, and I think that's why this story sort of resonates again. Is that you've got a little bit of kernel of truth there, that we all know what it's like to be inside, away, doing nothing. Hopefully, for most people, it was a very short period. Whereas if you're a criminal, you're looking at potentially decades of that sort of being cut off. And I couldn't do it. I mean, eventually you want to go back to your old life, and you want to see your friends, you want to go to the gigs for the concerts you like and enjoy. Otherwise, it's not much of a life. You're not really living, are you? You're existing.
Yeah, very, very difficult situation. Glad I'm not in it.
No.
Even writing about it, you're talking about all the different. I'm just kind of picturing different things through the book, and we've talked about the research. The amount of thought that you've put into the details.
It takes a lot of time. A lot of time.
So not a 27-day book.
No, I mean, I think I'm now running at something in the region of 3,000 to 4,000 hours per book. I mean, I can write fast, but it's just not as good, I don't think. And
for people like me who aren't great at maths, what does that equate to in terms of weeks and months? Right, okay.
Full-time, 9 to 5. But I've actually worked much more per day than that, and so slightly less. But it's a lot. It's a lot. And obviously, then you want to make it good enough that it sells enough to justify putting all that time in, which is a big challenge for all authors. Especially with
Ken's just commented. Sorry. Ken's just commented. Sorry, am I frozen on your screen?
No.
Okay, I'll keep talking then. Frozen on my own. Ken's just commented he thinks a lot of us would find it very hard to be in witness protection due to how we rely on the internet.
Oh, yeah, that's a very good point as well. And that we all do have sort of essentially signatures on the things we look at. We all have routines, and that sort of digital evidence, that would be a very interesting way to sort of hunt someone down if they were, you knew that they looked at Apple News first thing in the morning over their morning coffee, and then they went on a Facebook group or two that was a specific group. I mean, giving up UK Crime Book Club would be a huge wrench for many people. That so many people that is part of their daily routine.
Yeah.
I think that would be a massive challenge. That if you had to give up everything and you couldn't live the life you lived before, maybe you could find an interesting existence, something that was different, something that maybe even better. But it's a massive leap into the unknown.
I'm still frozen on my own screen, but unless anybody tells me any different, I've frozen on yours as well. Hopefully not a really dodgy picture of me like I usually get when I freeze. All right, okay. So how difficult or easy was it choosing the characters that would cross over? Because as you say, this is the DCI Martin, although not a DCI now, does feature in this book.
Yeah, he does make a cameo appearance. And I wanted to have that nod so that readers who are reading after reading Morton could see that some of their old favourites were coming back. I wanted to keep the characters whose stories I didn't think were completely finished. the characters still had somewhere left to go in their character trajectory, that there was something they wanted that they hadn't got while they were a junior detective. So for Ayala, it was leadership, and he was always in Morton's shadow. And there are hints at that all the way through the first 7 books, that he didn't feel he could grow while being part of the team rather than leader of a team. And for Rafferty, it's almost the same challenge. And women in policing have, their own very unique challenges in terms of being taken seriously. A few of the women I know who work for the Met and that become, I want to say, almost hyper masculine, that they have to outboy the boys in order to fit in. And I wanted to see what would happen if a character didn't try and follow that route and wanted to bring um, experience in sex crimes, and a more the feminine approach, which obviously requires, again, a lot more research, a lot more conversations with those who've been there, that trod that path. In order to be realistic, you want a feeling of verisimilitude, you want the character to be believable, and obviously, as a man who's never worked in the police, as a man, you've got to get it right. And if you don't speak to people, if you don't read about accounts, and if you don't try and sort of extrapolate the essence, the emotional core of it, the truth behind those stories, behind their careers, and then try and apply it to new situations, you could go very badly wrong and make it feel inauthentic, which would be the worst thing any author could do, is to come up with a story that just doesn't ring true. And if you read a story that is poorly executed, you immediately know that you don't buy it. The suspension of disbelief is gone. And for crime especially, I think that the suspension of disbelief is really quite difficult, because you're already suspending disbelief that there is an outrageous murder, that there's an incredibly clever criminal, but you don't want to suspend disbelief over authentic characters, over correct procedure, over the cars being the right cars, about the physics of it, about getting across London at rush hour and doing it in 10 minutes. All the things that if you live locally, or you've done that journey, or you've done that job, you're going to go, no, that just doesn't work. And I think that's a huge challenge, because obviously, you hope most authors are not serial killers. So getting that right, it's a challenge, isn't it? It's about making it interesting and plausible and believable and forensically accurate. But on a human level, you have to know why they did it, why they do it again, and if they regret it afterwards, and if that regret shows through in their actions.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about was you've got a special edition of Cleaver Square coming up.
Yeah.
So tell us a bit about that. You co-wrote that with your brother.
Yes. So this was years ago when we did the writing the book in 90 days. My brother was like 16 at the time, so he's since gone on he went to Oxford University and then Exeter, and he's now working in insurance. So he kind of found it very difficult to be in the public eye, so wanted to step away from that. So the rebranded ones have only got my name on, and the stuff that he wrote is not in the new edition. And what I wanted to do was to take some of the details that, if I'd written the whole thing as 7 planned books from the very off, because obviously when I wrote a challenge book, I wasn't thinking about laying seeds for books 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And if you want to sort of make everything gel together in a really authentic way, you almost want some of those hooks to be in book 1 and book 2 that you then leave and come back to in book 7. And trying to re-edit a book that you've already written once, I think is sometimes harder than writing a new one from scratch, because you need to keep enough of the story that you don't break it for any reader who doesn't reread it. So the story is the same, but the details are just slightly different, slightly more sophisticated, that you fix some of the issues potentially with the plot. So I certainly had a few sort of tweaks that needed to be made to the forensic timeline to make that more authentic. There are a few chapters that I revisited from Charlie, the little boy's point of view, that I think the syntax and things could have been a bit simpler for that point of view, that could have been slightly better written. So lots of little tweaks, but in the end, it amounts to an enormous amount of work, because again, I'm trying to take what I know now as an author with a decade plus of experience, and then retrospectively apply that to the ideas I had in 2012 and 2013 to make sure that the reader experience is up to par, which is always a challenge. You just want to make sure that everything is right, that everything flows, and that the stories as a series hit the right emotional and logistical and forensic notes, so that the whole thing feels like the domino effect, that the stuff that's happening now in the spin-off series with the Rafferty is inevitable, given what happened in Cleaver Square, what happened in Dead on Demand. And you start to see that some of the character journeys do carry across a little bit between series. And then, of course, you've got a bunch of new characters to meld in so that everything feels a bit fresher. And you've got a new, fresh perspective that's slightly different, that's thinking about things in a different way to your previous detective. But at the same time, they're doing it in the same London with the same criminals who are out and about, with the same resource constraints, with the same political background, and how that changes and how that sort of keys in with all the timelines and events and what's happened in the real world. Because, of course, when you write a book, you start writing it often contemporary. So if you're writing a book in 2012, you're writing about the world as it was in 2012 because you didn't know what the future would hold. But of course, then if things like Brexit happened, the war in Ukraine happened, and that one I think I've struggled a bit with because, of course, I've written about Ukrainian gangsters, and if I were looking at it with the sort of post 2023 lens, I'd go that is insensitive and a horrible thing to do, and that maybe I should stay away from that topic to avoid upsetting people. But at the same time, when you've written the book already and you've got a Ukrainian gangster and you've rooted it in Ukrainian culture, you've got Ukrainian roulette, and you've got all these hooks that are intended to set up that journey. And there's a lot of it in the book about the geography of Ukraine and how people can go across Ukraine, because obviously it's all very tightly woven in. And when you've got people using Ukrainian food on the table, they're using Ukrainian nicknames. There are a few jokes in there for the linguists among us, and you just want to make sure that everything calls back to dovetail all those details beautifully and make sure you haven't. It's just a nice fresh coat of paint on an old car that it can give it a new lease of life. And that update for Cleaver Square will be completely free to anyone who's already got it. So I will post that when it's available and
drop me a message. More than happy to let you post as well in here.
Wonderful, thank you.
When you are co-writing, because you've not only co-written with your brother, that's not your only co-writing project. So how has that been for you? And tell us about the other things that you've done.
So The Grifter was the other one I did, which I did with my better half. So we wanted to write about London's sort of homelessness epidemic, about the downtrodden, and that one was effectively looking at what would happen if someone invested all their life savings in a Ponzi scheme. So if you think Bernie Madoff and the collapse there, the thin end of the wedge where people suddenly lose a lot of money, it's often things like pensions that have been invested into funds and suddenly people are destitute when they shouldn't be. And in this particular instance, it's a guy who was an electrician by trade, and he got injured at work. He got a big payoff for his injury so that he could live the rest of his life reasonably comfortably. And he unfortunately made the mistake of investing all of his funds with a fraudster, and the fraudster then lost all his funds. And so he ends up homeless on the streets. He's got no security. He's lost his family. His wife's left him. He's basically hit absolute rock bottom. And we see him, and because of his injury at work, he's only got one leg. And he is in Canary Wharf, sitting on a bench, being ignored by everybody. He's filthy, and he's looking up at this building that is shiny and beautiful and fantastic. And on the front of it has got the name of the fraudster who stole everything from him. And that, I think, is a really unusual story of revenge, because you've got two people that effectively are the opposite ends of Maslow's pyramid. That you've got a fraudster who is trying to buy status and put his place in history, and he's trying to desperately keep his Ponzi scheme going so it doesn't collapse because he's robbing Peter to pay Paul. And then you've got a guy who's got literally pennies to his name, who is taking old Oyster cards and returning them for a refund, because people sometimes abandon them and you can get £2 a time, or £3 wasn't it back then? That no longer works, unfortunately. But there are lots of things that homeless people do that you wouldn't think about. That they often have a phone, but they don't have anywhere to live. That they're incredibly insecure. That they often get food donations more easily than they get cash. So it's trying to be authentic and looking at what it's like to be homeless in London, while also looking at what it's like to be under the pressure of running a huge but completely fake company and trying to work out how you keep your con going. And so you've got two guys who've both got problems with money at opposite ends of the spectrum. And the sort of, you can almost empathize with Bancroft, the bad guy, because he's suffering too. I mean, you don't want you want to hate him because he's horrible. What he's done is detestable. But at the same time, he's got financial pressures that are causing him to defraud people, to steal, to cheat, to lie, and everything he does is sort of plausible in the most horrible way. And
Yeah,
I find that really interesting, that you can have two characters who have completely different life circumstances and behave in equally different ways. And obviously, you'd be out for revenge if you lost everything, potentially. And I don't want to give away the ending on that one, but again, it's about how that character gets to his decision and what he does at the end and why he does it, and whether or not he's willing to be the better man. And I think that's quite interesting.
definitely. And I do really like it when characters receive closure, because it's not something we tend to get all the time in the real world.
No, definitely not.
And that it kind of, it's the thing that gnaws away at me, the unfinished things, the unanswered questions. So it's something that I really like. I will forgive, like it's my judge and jury moment. I'm fine to read something where there is an open-ended answer, as long as everything leading up to that is plausible.
Yeah. And sometimes there is no answer, but I think
Yeah.
most of the time you want a really strong resolution. And if you're not going to resolve the big question, you should resolve everything else. And there should be subplots that come to a nice, neat conclusion. That there should be things that are the finished story. Otherwise, people will get upset, and it's fine. You're allowed to not like a story without an ending. You expect to get a beginning and a middle and an end. And if the ending is you should go and imagine it, that's not going to be a story that everyone wants to read. But sometimes the story does call for an ambiguous ending. Does the bad guy get away? Does justice get served? And sometimes there is power in allowing those endings to be ambiguous and to allow the reader to project onto that what they would like to happen or what they'd hate to happen, because it's quite interesting to talk about. In one of my books is called 10 Guilty Men, which is a reference to Blackstone's formulation, the idea that it's better for 10 guilty men to walk free than to imprison one innocent man, which, I mean, you can play with the numbers as much as you like, but I think fundamentally you either agree with that concept that justice requires you to always keep a free man, an honest man free, or you should accept some cost that it's okay to imprison innocent people as long as overall most of the time you're doing it well. And those are two very different life approaches. And if you leave a story like that reasonably open ended at the end, you can project your experiences and decide which of those statements you think is true. And there's no right or wrong answer. And how you come to that is largely a product of your time and your upbringing. And people do come up with very strong opinions on that sort of story.
Isn't it funny, though, the things that you can kind of get away with on a TV show? If there was a cliffhanger on a TV show and I had to wait a week, I'd seethe for about 5 minutes. But you just get on with it. But when it's a book, I don't know. I think there's something much more personal about reading a book than there is about a TV show.
If you're going to spend 7, 8, 10 hours inside the reader's, the author's head and listening to their thoughts and their take on the world and their perspective, sometimes an audiobook would add another layer of lenses between the two there, but it's very intimate in a very one-directional way, that the author is effectively a broadcast medium through the book. But when you read it, you're reconstructing those thoughts and you're turning it into images and scenes. You're hearing the lines delivered, and it's your take on that story. So your reading experience is never going to be quite the same as everyone else's. And that's a good thing, because it means that all books are interesting and you can take what you want from that book. You can think about it from whatever angle drives you, and you can root for the bad guy sometimes if you want to. You can root for the underdog, which is usually my favorite thing to do. Or you can root for justice, or you can just root for carnage, blood, mayhem, and all the rest of it, because that is interesting too. And sometimes you just want a really interesting, high octane story. You don't necessarily want a lecture on philosophy, but sometimes you do. Sometimes you want a little bit of a thought to be left with at the end of it.
Yeah, no, completely agree. And I think probably one book would do something for me one week that it wouldn't the next. So I suppose it depends where the reader is in their lives as well as to what they take from it. You're absolutely right. We have hit 8 o'clock. I don't know how that has gone so quickly. And apparently I have been frozen on the screen, but people could still hear me. So thank you, Ken. So sorry you've had like a frozen image, but at least I'm not pulling a weird face for once.
No, you're good.
Thank you so much for joining us. Where can people buy Murdered by the Mob? Can they buy? Oh, I really want to show my signed copy, but nobody can see what I'm doing. I'll put a picture of it in the group afterwards.
Thanks.
So people can go and look, and I'll put a link with it.
It's all on Amazon, so that's probably the easiest place to get it. You can ask for it at your local library. They may or may not have it, but if they don't, they might get it in for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll go and order it from the library, get it from your local bookshop, get it from wherever. Your website as well, it's available on?
CCIMorton.com with all the links. I don't sell direct on my website, but all the links are there, so you can find it.
Brilliant. Sean, thank you so much. It's been really lovely chatting with you.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you to everyone who's been watching as well. Go and read Murdered by the Mob. Honestly, the fact that I don't know how you managed to, even with all the notes, I don't know how you balance all of this.
With a really good editor.
Absolutely. That is very good advice. Grab yourself a good editor.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much. And thank you, Sean. I hope you come back for the next book.
Cheers, will do. Thanks a lot. Bye all.